Hello, welcome to this live stream. I'm going to talk today about the reissue of my first album called Synthetic Block, and I'll also I've adapted a couple of the tracks on the reissue to the Mellotron so I can just play them with one instrument as opposed to the multiple layers of synths and whatnot that's on the original release. So I'll do that at the end. But this album was first released in 1998 on Mindspore Records. And this reissue includes the original album as well as over 3 hours of bonus material from around that time period. The reissue is out there for free. You can listen to it on any of the streaming sites. You can also go to Bandcamp and listen to it. You can listen to it here on YouTube if you just go to my channel and go to releases. And so there's multiple ways to listen if you so choose. So all the bonus material, like a lot of people that have a first album that comes out, you have a lot of material before that. So I have about a couple of years of material around that, including the pieces that helped get me signed. And mostly things that were released back in the day on cassette, when I used to release cassettes. So these go from 95 to 97, and then the CD came out in 98. So I guess a little background is probably useful at this point. I started playing instruments in the 70s when I was about 10 years old. And one of the things I did play was keyboards, but everything was expensive in that era. There was I was not going to have a keyboard. My folks were not going to buy me anything, and they certainly were not going to buy me a keyboard. So I actually ended up playing bass and guitar a lot, although I kept up on keyboards with friends of mine who may have had those, and I'm dating myself, but when I went to high school, we actually had an electronic music class, and they had a small Moog modular. I remember whatever the Moog was that was sold through Radio Shack, we had that too. There was a small ARP, the synth by the company ARP, some arpeggiators as well. Anyways, that really got me the bug of doing electronic music. But again, the equipment was out of my reach. I grew up being really into progressive rock, King Crimson, Van de Graaff Generator, Genesis, etc. And one of the things, Pink Floyd, one of the things that I always wanted to hear more of was those atmospheric moments of those progressive rock albums. So think of Silent Sorrows and Empty Boats from Lamb Lies Down on Broadway by Genesis, or Quicksilver from the soundtrack for the film More in 1968 from Pink Floyd, or some of the live improvisation they did, as well as King Crimson. Well, it turned out there was music like that, and that's when I discovered Tangerine Dream, Klaus Schulze, Cluster, Kraftwerk, a lot of those German bands, Neu, Manuel Gatsching, and Ashra. And I really got into that stuff. But again, I couldn't afford the equipment to make that kind of music. So I did start making some instrumental music with guitar and bass and keyboards, like cheap keyboards I could borrow from friends, and effects, TR-303 and 606 from Roland. I remember a friend of mine had those too and let me borrow those for a little bit. And so I could not have gotten to where I was unless I had friends at that time that had equipment. And because I was mainly a bass player and guitar too, I kind of did songwriting and the singer-songwriting thing, and then played in bands with bass. In college, I played in pit orchestras, and then I did coffee houses, but this kind of stuff was always lurking in the background. And then when I started having kids in the early 90s, it became clear that I had to do something solo. There was no way I was going to be able to have a full-time job, raise a family, and be able to play music to the extent that I wanted to. So I was like, you know what, I'd already actually put out a couple of cassettes of instrumental music. And I was like, you know what, let me buy a synth and see what I can do with that. And the first synth I got, which was, I believe, 1993 or 1994, was a Yamaha SY35. And I actually have some visualization videos of music that I made on some of these synthesizers. I'll try to link to them if I can remember. And so I bought that. A friend of mine had a Yamaha QI10, and I used that as a sequencer and used the sounds. And I just started to create music, and I was really getting into it. And I expanded my synths with a rack mount. I got the Vintage Keys by Emu. I'm going to talk a bit about gear during this talk as well. So you probably remember, if you were into it in the 90s, EMU put out a lot of rack mount synths that were focused on hip hop, or Classic Keys was another one, Vintage Keys for that analog stuff. They also put out something called Identity. I think that was closer to the late 80s or 2000, that had a lot of arpeggiators, and I tried all of those. And I did end up buying Classic Keys. I had Vintage Keys for a while, so I started to make these cassettes. And I quickly realized the limitations of the sequencer on the QI10, but I had already made the decision I did not want to use computers. I mean, we're talking 93, 94. I certainly didn't have my own computer, and I think I was just beginning to use them. I was using them in my job, so it just wasn't possible. And so I started looking at workstations. And I did put out one cassette called Organizing the Struggle, and all of the pieces on here are on the Reissue. And then I just went to I think I went to a Sam Ash, and I was just looking at the synths, and I fell in love with a Roland XP-50. It was an all-in-one. It had a disk drive. It had a sequencer. The sounds were amazing. It had some expansion ports. So I cobbled the money together, and I got that. And I started doing recording, and that's where some of the other cassette stuff comes from. And I also used a little external equipment, but I started getting in this mindset, no, I just want to use the XP-50. I'm going to use it for sequencing. I'm going to do it for everything. So this was probably the end of, actually this would have been 1995. So I just started to create some music. I was putting cassettes out. I eventually made a very long track called The Science of Forget. It's about 39 minutes. Everything I'm talking about is on the reissue if you want to listen to it. I at that point had spent some money to buy a couple of the expansion cards that Roland used to have, the JVXP cards, which I thought were great. There was a keyboards of the 60s and 70s that I got that had electric pianos, organs, some Mellotrons, and then there was a Vintage Keys, I believe is what it was called, expansion card. And that had Mellotrons and synths and a whole bunch of stuff. So between that and the sounds that were on the synth, I felt like I had a lot of stuff to work with. So I created this very long track, and it was all on sequencer. I should have pulled it out. I had a notebook. I had to manually, as I'm going through, I used pieces of paper to hold notes down, and then I would have to change programs or reload different sequences. It was a lot of work, but it was a lot of fun, and I learned a lot about synthesis and a lot about the equipment itself and recording. And I could not have done all this unless, or I wouldn't have gone in this direction unless I had children. I felt like I didn't have a lot of time, and this enabled me to do things, leave it, come back to it. And at the same time that all this was happening, so this is the mid-90s, listservs and mailing groups were starting to get popular, so I was very active in rec.music.ambient, and so were a lot of other musicians, and we'd share tapes, and occasionally people would come in looking for music labels, and that's what happened. I believe it would have been late 96 or 97. The gentleman who started Mindspore Records popped a message saying, hey, anybody, I'm looking to put out some music, send to this. So I sent the long piece, and it was on a DAT. It was on a DAT. I was recording into a DAT recorder at that point. And he liked it, but he emailed me back and said, this is kind of good, but do you have anything that's shorter? I don't want to put out this big, long thing. So I'd actually been working on some music as well, and I sent that out to him, and he's like, this is going in the right direction. So what I do want to talk about here is that when I start talking about these things, this is the kind of stuff where you have choices to make, right? You can stick to your art and be like, no. I could have been like, no, I want to put out this long thing and I'm not interested. I've always had kind of a dual view of music, i.e. there's a creative aspect and there's a business aspect. If somebody comes to me and they want to put out my music or they want to pay me to do a gig, to me that's no different than any other job I've had. Yes, you get to actually tell me your opinion of what you want me to do. So I was completely open to that. And actually it was a good impetus to keep going with that music. So I sent him a bunch of stuff. He liked it, but clearly it was from one synth. You could tell that it was from one synth. So I don't want to use Seth's full name, but I'll say Seth from Mindspore was actually lived on the West Coast and was coming to New York and was like, hey, I'm going to come. I'm coming to the city. Why don't, come meet me, blah, blah, blah. So we had lunch, we talked, we got on, and he was like, okay, I'd like to put your stuff out. And then he was like, would you be open to using more equipment? And I'd be, of course. I said, the reason I only have one synth is I really can't afford anything else. And he was like, that's okay, I'll ship you equipment. I'm like, seriously? And he goes, yeah, I got a bunch of stuff in my studio I'm not using. Take a few months and see what you can come up with. Yeah, I'm still blown away by that. So Seth sends me a Nord lead. That was, at the time, that was the only thing that was out, the rectangle box. And he sent me effects too, Eventide harmonizer and whatever that famous TC Electronics delay was it the M1000 or M100 or something like that? I'm probably wrong with the name. So anyways, he sends me like $10,000 of equipment through the mail, UPS or FedEx or whatever. So I get that, and all of a sudden the universe expands a little. However, one of the reasons I went into New York that time to meet him for lunch is I had decided I wanted to expand. I wanted to get a drum machine, and the Quasi MIDI 309, if anybody remembers that, QM309 had just come out, and I was like, I want that. And so I think, met with Seth, we talked, I left. I think it must have been Rudy's. I think Rudy's sold Quasi MIDI stuff back in the day. And I bought it. Had it in a bag in a box, went back on the train, brought it home, hooked all that up. About a week or so later, all Seth's gear showed up that he let me borrow, and then I kind of had already had the tunes that we'd agreed on, and I just worked on fleshing them out. So those are all the songs that ended up on the first album. There's actually a couple that only got part way through that I put on my second album. But all the stuff I had done before the drum machine, before I had Seth's equipment, is on the release as well. So that's kind of the short and long story of how I got signed. There was a contract. Seth was looking to make this a real label. So he, before my release, a compilation came out, and I wish I had pulled that out, and I can't remember the name, but there was a lot of folks on there. And then he put out a CD by a group, Ambient Temple of Imagination, Kevin Crossland recording under Cave Star. He said, we're all kind of recording under different names, so can you come up with something? And I was like, ugh. That's how I got to Synthetic Block. And unfortunately, not unfortunately, but I had to stick with that name for a number of years. But anyways, this was a serious thing. He was putting money behind it for promotion. I actually got an advance. And we're not talking, get rich money. We're talking, this is electronic music, ambient music. But still, here's a guy that was motivated and gave it a go. And part of the promo was getting a kiosk in Tower Records across the country. So my music got out there. They sent a lot of promos out. And like a lot of people for the last, it's 28 years now since this came out, I've just been cashing in on that, so to speak. I mean, it's a little more complex than that. But that's how I got my name out there. And that led to other people coming and say, hey, I like this. Would you give me a track for a compilation? Or people were putting out compilations. So around this time, it's called Gold Try. This was off of one of the music groups back in the day, and there's a track on here, so that's on there. So there's just a lot of different stuff. Again, you have, when you're kind of gearing up and waiting to put out your first album, or at least in the olden days, you always had a lot of material. So it's great to be able to get all that out there without having to worry about manufacturing essentially a box set. And, it taught me a lot about making music, recording music, but also dealing on the business side. It is a bit of a cliche, but not just bands, but working with other folks, particularly when you're dealing with the business aspects of music. The more laid back and amenable you are to somebody that's going out of their way to either give you money or spend money on your behalf, I've always been like, yeah, this is a collaborative thing. And because if I didn't, I can guarantee you right now, I would have never had that music put out, and thus no one else would have wanted to put anything out as well. So all through, this was the first of 7 CDs that came out between 98 and 2010. I think, and for all of them, I was amenable to suggestions, particularly around packaging and cover art and the music as well. Some people made more comments than others. I didn't follow all of them, but for the most part, that enabled me to keep a relationship with these people. Obviously, all the deals I ever had ran out, and that's why I've now I'm going to start putting them all out there with a lot of the bonus materials. So that's the story. I mean, it's luck. A lot of it's luck. I just happened to decide, you know what, I want to play keyboards or synthesizers. Let me see what I can do with this. I answered this query from someone looking to put ambient music out. And before that, I'd answered a few other queries, and they had kind of gotten almost to the end stage. But for whatever reason, not on my end. It was more like, yeah, actually, I can only do this or I can't do that. And it didn't work out. But I do not want to discount the being in the right place at the right time and luck. I mean, there's a lot of electronic musicians out there, both in that time and now, who are great. And you just, the door is narrow, it's eye of the needle kind of thing. And it's just the way it worked out. So I'm very grateful for Seth and, taking a chance on me. And there was a lot of good music on that label as well. So let me move now into the music. I will, once YouTube processes this video, I will put timestamps in here just if you want to skip all the talking. You can go right to the music or vice versa. So the first thing I'm going to play, this isn't really a complete piece. Let me get all this product out of here for now and put it over there. And let's see, I don't want to put headphones on. So I will go in when I'm ready to play, and I'll mute the mic here. But the first thing I'm going to play is actually the first track from the original Synthetic Block album, called Silver Sky. It was built around a clavinet line. Mellotron is a clavichord. And so I'm just going to kind of do the main line of that piece. There's some violins here. The 3 violins. So I'm using 3 violins from the Mark II on the Mellotron, and I'm using the M400 clavichord. The Mellotron is going into a volume pedal, and then that goes into the GT1000 core, so I'll be using a bunch of different effects for this piece and the next one. I'm actually using the RE202 as a echo, as a space delay, as opposed to the looper. So I've got 2 delays going, a longer one and a shorter rhythmic one for this piece. Then I'm going to switch to a different effects patch that's really a more flangey, filtery, resonant delay. And for that, I'll be doing a piece called Into. I'll be using the violins and the M400 bass flute. And that piece wasn't on the original album. It was on one of my cassettes, and it's something, I wrote it on piano, so I've always been able to play it on any keyboard. And I actually re-recorded it for a future album, and when that gets released, I'll go through that. And then maybe at that point, I'll play it on bass. But anyways, okay, so we're going to do Silver Sky first. I'm not going to come back with the talking, and then I'll just switch everything very quickly, and then I will do Into. Wait. space echo going off in the background. So I adapted them as best I could using the sounds, but you know, it's 2 sounds as opposed to multiple layers of things that you would find. So thanks for listening all about my first my first album. Again, it's on, there's links below and timestamps eventually, but it's available out there on every streaming site. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. I appreciate it.